we all are with Monarch Digital in Colorado Springs, and the whole good cop, bad cop thing just came from me. If you could see our office, when these guys are saying, I think it should be done like this the way all the time. How are we ever going to get the client to pay for it? Back and forth and back and forth. And finally I said, I'm tired of it. Go give a presentation at DrupalCamp. And so that's the genesis of this. And so a lot of this will be a whole lot better session if you ask lots of questions or challenge these guys. So we did a little presentation like this down at the Southern Colorado Drupal Users Group, and this thing, after all the discussion, turned out to be an hour and a half. So we do have a BOF that's after lunch that will continue this discussion on with anybody who is interested in your particular situation or challenging the guys further. So with that, there's Caleb and Brian.
So first I'd like to give a little bit of a background of kind of what prompted this discussion and why we're here presenting. When I first started with Monarch about 2 years ago, we were developing through FTP, where we would FTP a file down, edit the code in it, and FTP it back up, and put it straight to the production server and cross our fingers and hope that nothing broke. And when it did break, we would scramble and hope that we fixed it before the client called and yelled at us. So one of the things that has been really passionate for me is learning the best practices and how do I manage development so that I'm not stressing myself out, so that the clients remain happy, and so that we have a good documented workflow. A lot of these things are unfortunately not taught in schools. I have a degree in computer science, and most of these concepts I was never taught. I was kind of left to learn them on my own and learn them the hard way through the clients. So some of the topics that we're going to try and get through, there's 4. The first one that I started working with is source control. I had some experience with source control and with SVN and CVS in school, but I never really knew how to implement it or even really why I should implement it. So we're going to talk about source control, kind of what it is and why you should use it, and what are the advantages of having a source control system. Then we're going to talk about local development. Like I said before, when I first came on to Monarch, we were editing right on the production server through FTP. And there's a lot of problems with that. You can solve them if you have a local environment on your computer. That can solve a lot of those problems. We're going to talk about why you should have a local environment, what are the advantages, and why you should not, under any circumstances, be editing directly on your production server. Should be a no-brainer, but unfortunately, in school you're taught, okay, here's a server that you upload your class files to and show it to them. The instructor looks at it right on your production server. So, that's not the way to edit. You should have some kind of local development and then have some kind of development, staging, production workflow. Then we're going to talk about ticket tracking. We've used spreadsheets in the past where you just have a list of items. These are the tasks that I'm working on. But ticket tracking can give you a lot of advantages with history and keeping track of what it is you're actually working on and what's the status of that task or that project. So there are several ticket tracking systems out there. We'll talk about what we use and why you should be using that. Finally, if you're doing any kind of custom module development or developing custom themes, you should be providing some kind of a user interface to your clients. That's kind of the reason that we have Drupal, is so that clients can go and edit the content themselves. So you should avoid hard coding any data, any content into your themes or into your modules. You should provide some kind of a user interface for them. So kind of the structure of how this presentation will work is I'm going to talk about one of these topics, and this is why you should use it and where it works well. And then Brian's going to take over and give kind of the client's perspective, because a lot of these add a lot of overhead to your production costs. It's very fast to download a file through FTP and then upload it to your production server. You can get stuff done real quickly, but trying to convince the customer that they should pay for the extra time can be difficult. So I'm going to play the good cop and say these are the right way to do it. Brian's kind of going to play the bad cop and from the client's perspective and say this is where you could run into problems convincing the client, or this is where people have issues with these topics. So.
First of all, I'd like to stress the point that I am not against any of these. These are all best practices. My point is that they shouldn't be 100% mandatory. You're going to find very rare situations where it's just not going to work. And I hear a lot of people saying that source control 100%. If you're not using it, you're completely wrong. User interfaces, local, you develop locally always. It's just, this is a real world. Do things by the book, well, sometimes the book doesn't stress everything. So this is just my perspective. Will your client understand when you tell them that they're gonna have to pay more than they thought because you're gonna have to add source control? You're gonna have to add a nice user interface to the module. Some things I might ask is, why should I spend more money to safeguard your mistakes? If you make a mistake, you can bring it back to source control, but why are you gonna make mistakes? I'm paying you to do this right. I don't need user interface for my module. It will all be static. Okay, you've heard this before, and we know it's not true, but they believe it's true, and how are you gonna convince them that they're wrong? I changed some CSS. Why should I have to learn Git? If they change CSS and it's on Git, well, they're gonna have to, do a commit. They're gonna have to, of course, do it on the development site. And if they do it on a live site, do they have to tell you each time that, hey, I made a change, could you please fix this? We have some clients that actually do CSS changes and stuff, and do they tell us every time that they did it? No, we'll log in and see that there's changes. Oh, I'm glad I found that. I made this little model just as an example. Pretty common, you see a lot of structures and triangles. This is pretty much what you're dealing with. And I kind of proportioned it into points. You have 10 points. Usually it comes to usability, customizability, and cost. If you want full usability and customizability, the cost is going to be very high. If you just want low cost, then you're pretty much going to have to choose one of these or a little bit of both. You can't have everything, can't have a cake and eat it too. Usually you can only have 2 of these at a time, unfortunately.
So the first one we're going to talk about is source control. So my question initially is there any good reason not to use source control? I would be under the opinion that every site you have should be under some kind of source control, whether you're using Git, SVN, CVS, or just printing out a stack of code changes and keeping it in a file folder somewhere. You should have some kind of revision control, some kind of source control, so that you can keep track of history of what's been happening. This is especially important when you're working in a team. The bigger your team, the more important it is to keep track of who changed what and why they made those changes, along with the ability to revert if something goes wrong. So I think the main advantage of source control is providing that history of who changed what and being able to go back and look at the progress that you've made on a site. There's a lot of times, even when I'm developing individually on a site that I'm the only one working on, sometimes I'll want to go back and see what I wrote several months ago that I may have changed since then, but I want to go back and see what it looked like several months ago, so I can do that with source control. Also, keeping track of versions of the site. You may release version 1, and then you want to go on and continue developing, but you don't want to lose what you have in version 1. So as you're developing, you can keep track of all of those changes, but if you need to, doing stuff with tagging and branching, you can go back and always see what version 1 looked like, or you can always, if you're moving to another server, you always have that code there. So I think the biggest advantage is the history. Also, security. If you have source control and if somehow your site gets hacked and someone's going in there and changing your files, it's trivial to go back and get rid of those if it's under source control. You have control over where everything's been, and so it can work with security also. So my opinion is that no matter what site you're working on, you should be using some kind of source control and keeping track of that. And it gets more important as your team grows and as you get more and more people working on a site.
Okay, so source control is great. So why on earth wouldn't you want to use it? Well, there are rare occasions that it could get in the way. Source control is great though. If you're not using it, you probably should. But if you do use it, you might find yourself running into one of these situations. A client that makes frequent CSS or small code changes on the site. Should they know how to commit it? Should they know how to push it, pull it to the repository? Do you want to take the time to teach them, or do they want to take the time to learn?
I would say that if a client is doing this, I would tell them that they're going to be responsible for all charges for me to be fixing their mistakes.
That's my point.
They can't. I mean, I wouldn't support a client that did this. Period. End of story.
Pretty much. My point is you. Okay, to put source control on like Git, it's like 5 minutes. It's very quick. There's little overhead, doing the commits, push and pulls, but it works real well. There's really not too much of a problem with it. the most you can do is go over and tell your client this is how it's gonna work, and if you don't use it, there's a chance that you could lose everything, and is it worth a couple of dollars? And if they don't wanna do it, some people are saying, if you don't want it, or if you want source control, we're not gonna do your project. That might be a little harsh, it's situational, it's preference, but let's, since we're on the subject of source control, how many of you use source control? Okay, how many of you use source control but don't use it 100% of the time? Oh wow, that's actually pretty surprising. Any examples of why you don't use it 100% of the time? Does anyone have a?
If it's a really small team, if it's just 2 of you on a site, then, sometimes we just.
Is there a lot of coding or activity going on?
No, code we'd always keep converting.
Is it like a brochure site?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you might find smaller situations like, we have a lot of smaller sites like that, and I'm always like, well, why put Git on it? I mean, we make backups. If it goes down, the backup's all they need. I mean, database and the code never changes. Caleb says 100%
Right.
of the time.
I lean towards any time you touch a piece of code, that's when you put it in version control. If you're just installing a Drupal site and configuring everything in the database, then you're not changing any code. There's no point to do source control. But as soon as you make one change to a CSS file or one change to a line of code, that's when it needs to go into source control, because that's when you want to keep track of what's happening within the source control. So, also along those lines, does anybody work with clients who want to make code changes? Work with clients that either edit CSS or want to actually make code level changes? We have several clients that do that, and you can't really tell them, I'm sorry, you can't go in and touch the CSS. If you break something, that's going to be an extra cost for us to fix it. But,
So
but you
give 'em
can't
a-
tell that you can't deny them access.
You give them a CSS override sheet then, that they can do whatever the heck they want with, and leave it at that.
Yeah, we try to give them development sites too, but they do what they want. And sometimes, we even have some that will go in and make small PHP changes and stuff like that. It's just hard to keep track of. They won't tell us.
Yeah, I'd be saying goodbye.
Well, I mean, it's a good client. It's a good client. They know what they're. And so far, that hasn't been a problem. But
Yeah.
when is it gonna blow up?
So for us, we sell to them the value that we're providing by teaching them to use these best practices.
Yeah.
But do they want to buy that?
Well,
Should,
as a
why should I have to
professional,
learn Git?
I mean, as a professional, they should want to get better at what they're doing. I mean,
But we all have those clients that say, "I'm paying you for this. I don't want to learn it. Well, why am I paying you if I'm gonna have to learn it?"
no, but what I mean is, if they're not paying you, if they're doing the CSS.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
If they're paying you to do it, then they're paying you to do it.
Yeah, you can stress the advantage, and you can try to stress how important it is, but I guess it just depends on what kind of client you have.
All right, so any other questions on that, or?
Well, you can also address this going into the deal. I mean, when you're first opening up the store with this client, you let them know that you've got policies about this and that there's best practices and that your pricing model is going to follow those best practices. And if they want to complain about the pricing model, then you can go ahead and draw a line through that and let them know that they're assuming responsibility.
Exactly.
So a lot of it is dealing with small clients versus larger clients. Larger clients, they have the budget to pay for all this, but sometimes you're a small, mom and pop shop that just want a website. It's harder to convince them to accept all of these best practices, and what is going to increase that budget.
When you're dealing with some of these small shops too, I mean, like some of them, I wouldn't be surprised if some of them are going to be on like this $4 or $5 a month hosting, right? So they're not hosting on your server; they're on their own server that's only like $4 or $5 a month. They may not have command line access. Their host might not provide them command line access, so they've got to do their FTP or whatever. So I would imagine with some of your smaller clients, they don't even have the technical infrastructure that's going to allow them to use any version control. It doesn't matter whether you pick Git or something else.
But even so, you're going to be, if their target site has nothing but, the Apache, right? And they can't get to it through any other way. It's got to come from somewhere, and the somewhere can have version control. And then they take that and they ship it up to the site, and that's just a black hole that things go into. but wherever it comes from, that's where you put the version control.
You know, another thing too that I've encountered is even bigger clients who have budget, maybe or maybe not, they might understand IT concepts. And they're not people making the CSS changes, you understand, but they may not understand that, oh, we've got it under Git and we're pulling and pushing and this and that, and they don't give a rat's ass. They, you know, does the site work or not? And so this whole concept is really academic to them. It's just, is the site running or not? Do you like, you know, do you have it under control? And so in that regard, you say, yeah, we're using best practices. And great, good. But you know, then they want to make some basic changes to maybe their whole hosting environment or something, and you start talking in terms of Git, and their eyes glaze over, and they don't understand.
Well, another thing that happens a lot of times is you run into urgency situations, emergencies, and they'll really want you to circumvent your best practices to be able to solve the emergency. And that's just real life, like you say. And you know, I think that's when it's really important that you train them well in the whole process of getting to this point. So hopefully there won't be as many emergencies, and when there is an emergency, they know how you're going to respond. And you also have a good practice. You know how to get that done, and probably it's part of your second nature, and you can get it done quickly. So that the emergency doesn't cause you to drop your best practice and your discipline.
Okay, so good. I think it's about time to move on to the next topic. So we're gonna talk a little bit about developing locally. Again, my background is you develop through FTP and you upload it directly to your site, and you download what you want to change, work on it, and upload again and see if it works. Lately though, I've become a huge fan of developing locally. I got rid of Windows on my work computer, installed Ubuntu, and never looked back. And Ubuntu is great for local development. You get the LAMP stack automatically, and there's a lot of stuff you can do within Ubuntu and within Linux that helps with local development. But there's tools for whether you use Mac, there's tools for Windows for doing local development. I think the biggest advantage of local development is you can work even without internet. Your internet goes down, and you're still working. You can still work. Once things come back up, you can sync with the repositories online. So even we use Comcast in the office, and just the other day we had 2 outages for 15 minutes or more where we had no internet access. And while we're on the phone waiting for Comcast to figure out what's going on, what can we do? If we're not developing locally, you're stuck and you're just sitting there waiting for everything to come back on and wasting time. So if you're developing locally, I think the biggest advantage is you can work when you're offline. But there's a number of other advantages. There's a lot of IDEs and a lot of tools that work well locally. Stuff like the develop module or doing simple tests. A lot of these can add overhead to your production server. If you're running the develop module on your production server, it can add overhead, but you can run that locally and have all your develop tools and put in your debugging stuff without affecting a production server or without affecting the performance on something like that. Also, if you want to break something locally, you can. It used to be if you're editing on a production site or if you're editing somewhere up on the web and you break something, it's a panic and you have to rush to try and figure out, okay, fix this before I get a call. Even if you're developing on a test site and you have a team of people that are all developing on the same test site, if I go on there and if I break something, that means the rest of the developers can't work until I fix that error. And so it's still a rush, even if it's a test site and not production, it's still a rush to fix it and figure out what's going on, and it can be stressful. Whereas when I'm developing locally, every time I see a white screen or some PHP error, it's like, yes, I got an error, sweet, because it's local and I'm not affecting anybody. I can go in, I can play with it, I can take the time that I need to figure out what's wrong and fix it the right way. So I'm not affecting somebody else's development and I'm not interrupting their workflow. Same thing with a server. If I want to tweak a server setting, I can tweak it locally and see what happens. If it blows up, then I know, oh, don't do that again, and I can go in and fix it, again, without affecting the production server or without affecting other developers if I'm sharing a test site.
You probably ought not have Devel running on a production server anyway, because you can blow your site up so badly it's ridiculous.
Right.
please don't do that. Don't run Devel on your production server.
Yeah, and there's a number of other tools. I put some IDEs up there that I've had success with. NetBeans works, has debuggers and things you can use in there. Work great for locally. VirtualBox is something I've had a lot of success with on Windows. There are tools like WAM that you can use in Windows that will give you a stack with Apache and PHP and MySQL, but there's a lot of configuration you have to do to make it work on Windows, and that configuration is completely different than what's on your production site. So you may get it working perfectly locally and then send all your files to your production server, and it doesn't work at all because server configurations are different. So with VirtualBox or VMware, something like that, you can create a virtual machine and have a virtual server that's running locally, and you can install Ubuntu server or whatever server your production is running, and you can configure it exactly like your production server, so you know exactly what it will look like when you send it to production. So I've had a lot of success using VirtualBox locally, and again, if you break something, you just get rid of that virtual machine and install your default again, and you're right back to where you started without having to actually go in and try and fix it if you broke something. So, as I always say, there's really no place like 127.0.0.1. Develop locally. It's worth it.
So why wouldn't you develop locally? Well, it is personal preference. Mostly for smaller shops. Once you get into larger companies and you have 5 people working on one development site, you're gonna run into a lot of trouble, and you definitely should be local. But if it's like 1 or 2 people, who cares if you get a PHP error on a development site? No one should be on it anyways. With a development site, you also get a small staging site too. You can serve your development site as a staging site. If you're local, you're pretty much going to have a staging site. How are you going to show the customer what you've done? How are they going to approve? You're going to have to send them to some third-party software like GoToMeeting so they can see exactly what you've done. With the staging site, you say, hey, go to this URL. How's it look? Great. Throw it up there. Local, it's great with source control. It goes hand in hand. Multiple people working on one file. You know, they send it up to a repository. It does merge conflicts, everything like that. So you're good to go. Development site. Unfortunately, 2 people are working on the same file, you might run into errors there. But like I said, small shop, it's great. We have run into situations where the environment shows differently on localhost. Works perfectly, hey, this is great, bring it up to the live site, it doesn't work. We really don't know exactly how to track these and why these happen. It's pretty rare, but it does happen. I mean, has anyone run into that situation where it works locally and on the live site, just nothing? Yeah, it's just server configurations. Your local server configuration may be a lot different from what you're using on your actual website. Sure, with localhost you can work from home without internet, without any internet access. But with a development site, you can work from any computer. With local, I mean, your computer breaks, you don't have a computer with you, someone calls, hey, this is going wrong. Well, you're gonna have to make changes on the live site, I guess, suck it up. With a development site, you can do it from any location, and then just send it to the live site once it's done, complete, tested. And I haven't had any problems with development site showing different because it's on the same servers. Configurations are exactly the same. So I guess some questions is who develops locally, okay, and who develops exclusively on a development site. So probably more local than development here. The people on the development site, any of you work for a larger company? So you do development site for a larger company? How does that work? Do each developer get their own staging area, or do you all work on one development site and just hope you don't get errors?
Just manage. We all know what we're doing, so it's just it happens.
Just to get lucky.
Talk. Coordinated enough to not have those issues.
Yeah.
You use source control?
Yes.
Get it, something?
CVS.
I do both, because it depends what clients I'm doing. I mean, some clients, I'll grab it down local and like got it on my computer, I'll do whatever. But I got other clients that I'm not even really, I mean, I could develop, they couldn't prevent me from grabbing stuff from local, but they want me developing on their machine. And I've just got to do it. And they've got development, they've got production, but I mean, honestly, I had a situation not that long ago, and I don't know if Celine is in here now or not. Not that it's a secret, but I brought down their production server because we had the development machine, we got the production machine. I forgot that we had something going on in development where we were changing some template files based on new functionality they were putting in. And I mean, it was stupid, it was my mistake. We don't have it under source control, but still, I just said, oh, I'm gonna do this really quick, get this up here. Copied the template file from the development machine to the production machine, and all it would have taken was for me to do a backup of that one, and I could right away on my own. But no, I was in a rush, I grabbed this template file, copied it over, and now I hosed their site, because the template file had functions and code in it that, I forgot, like, oh crap, I forgot we had this in the
So your
works on
development
development.
site's actually different from your live site?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, we just had different stuff going on. And so what we had to do actually is I had to call our tech support people because they got their backups that they'd gotten, and they were like, oh crap, could you guys go grab this backup? I just need you to grab this one file for me. But we had a half hour there where their production site was not navigable just because I overlaid.
yeah, source control is definitely great for even development sites.
Yeah.
I typically do local, but one example, a client had a proprietary third-party program that I had to integrate in and it was compiled for a very specific thing in Linux that I could not get locally and so forth. So in order to integrate this $10,000 piece of software that they just couldn't get compiled on my local, I had to be doing this live. I had to actually make a thing on the production site, hide it so no one could see it, and then just test it as best I could, but not fun.
So I'm curious too, of those that develop locally, I'm always interested in finding tools and things to help with development. So I'm curious, what kind of tools do you use as far as IDEs that you prefer and operating systems that you like developing on? Just kind of curious hearing some opinions on that.
Really like, I'm honest.